With the abolishment of slavery in 1838, new labor was required to sustain the sugar industry in the Caribbean. The colonial powers experimented with indentured laborers from Europe, China, and India, but quickly realized that Indians would be best suited for the plantation. From 1845 until the end of the indentured period in 1917, over 500,000 East Indians were brought to the Caribbean as indentured laborers. Naturally, this large influx of Indian immigrants to Guyana would have adverse effects on the African populations who had newly acquired freedom from slavery to the plantation economy. In fact, the plantation owners had originally planned to use indentured laborers to break apart rising African militancy against the plantocracy and create competition in the labor force in order to slow down the development of a unified African working class and to be able to pay both African and Indian laborers lower wages. The plantocracy began to understand that dividing Africans and Indians allowed there to be a split within the working class, a split that the planter class consistently worked to maintain, to have the ability to control both Indians and Africans more effectively due to the willingness of a larger number of workers who could quickly fill positions of those who resisted. Therefore, racism became a rationalization of an entire economic system to categorize different types of laborers in order to contribute to the development of the economy and to divide and reduce both Indians' and Africans' capabilities to unite against their common oppressors. As Walter Rodney notes, in 1905, when there was an uprising of Africans in Guyana, the colonial governor moved against this uprising with an intense severity and swiftness because they had intelligence that the Indian indentured workers were about to join the uprising, and they said that this would be the most dangerous thing that would happen in the history of this colony if we had a joint uprising of both Africans and Indians.
And it is only in the plantation society, only in the slave society of the New World, that the framework was established precisely for those institutional relations, so that the racism ceased to be merely a quirk, a personal aberration, and became instead a rationalization for a whole system of production. And this is why there's a qualitative difference between racism as understood in the New World, as it developed particularly in the 17th and 18th century, and any other acts of individual prejudice which can historically be illustrated as having occurred prior to that date. In other words, it seems to me that even after one has illustrated that racism existed before capitalism, it still remains true that a capitalist system, in a particular phase of its accumulation, in which it required to subordinate non-white people in a particular way, was responsible for both aspects of modern racism, namely the involvement of race as a category in determining how people had access to the means of production, the involvement of race in the actual production relations, and secondly, inevitably, the dissemination of racist ideas as a necessary part of the ideological superstructure to maintain that type of exploitation.
Whenever there were social conflicts between Africans and Indians, we need to really look at the ideas that were expressed by the two groups and the economic situation that the two groups were in at the time. If we analyze conflicts in this light, we can clearly see that the conflict of racialization between Africans and Indians is rooted in an economic problem. Following the end of the indentureship period in 1917, there was increasing resistance to the rule of the plantocracy, and more importantly, resistance to British colonial rule. Indians and Africans in Guyana began to understand that they had a common enemy in the British, and began to forge alliances to work to the common goal of decolonization and political autonomy. Chetty Jagan and Forbes Burnham would emerge as two leaders representing the united interests of both Africans and Indians, working together over several years, eventually leading to the creation of the Progressive People's Party in 1950. However, due to the anti-colonial sentiments expressed in the party's political agenda, the British government was threatened by the co-leaders of the PPP, as Jagan and Burnham were able to forge a powerful nationalist movement that was to pose a formidable threat to the colonial hegemony, garnering the support of both black and brown working-class people against the white colonizers and their local representatives. This led to the suspension of the Constitution in 1953 by the British, who planted the seeds of division between Jagan and Burnham, causing a split in the party. With the emergence of Burnham's new party, the People's National Congress, racial divisions between Africans and Indians re-emerged with a new level of severity. Burnham, who collaborated with the British and the Americans against Jagan and the PPP, would take power in 1964, solidifying the racial tensions between Africans and Indians for decades to come.
The problem of racial cleavage, racial antagonism, and distrust, which the last government allowed to develop during its term of office, is still with us. But our government recognizes this as a challenge which it intends to accept and which it is determined to overcome. My government considers that it is a matter of the greatest importance and the utmost urgency that an atmosphere of relaxation be established immediately. The reduction of tension, which is already apparent and which will become more pronounced with every passing day, when it is realized that not only are we intent on being fair and just, but also that we have at our disposal the means to carry out our intention, is merely the first fruits of our attainment of office.
The sentiments of racial equality expressed by Burnham turned out to be complete falsehoods throughout the years that the PNC was in power. Several years later, Chetty Jagan and the PPP would come to power. However, not much would change in the years to come under his regime either.
The price of rice has been readjusted. I heard this morning that old age pensions are going to be adjusted. And of course, the cost of food, flour has been reduced by about $200 per bag. Is this a trend that you hope to continue until you bring all the prices and the cost of living down?
Yes, because our government principally will be a government which will be looking after the working people's interest and to achieve not just economic growth but human development, meaning we must tackle the basic needs of the people, and the cost of living is very high in this country, and we want to ensure that the life of the people is improved.
Undoubtedly, Jagan clearly holds a more socialist-oriented position than Burnham, but in the years that the PPP was in office, Guyana continued to experience high levels of poverty throughout the country. Furthermore, the continuing regime changes between Indian-led parties or African-led parties have left the Guyanese people in poverty and civil and political strife.
We have racial tendency among the 6 races. It only comes about around election times because it's fueled by these political leaders and these political parties. You have unemployment amongst the young people. A lot of the persons who are in poverty and unemployed, they have insurmountable amounts of problems. You find some not being able to eat.
You invite me to a war party, me no wanna go. Everybody seems to be inviting me to a war party, me no wanna go. Heard about the last one, so thanks, but no thank you. Home, yo home. You killed off all the Indians and you killed off all the slaves, but not quite so you kill off the remains. You look for me.